This is a Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel. Can you tell how long it's been going on for? 30 minutes! This particular duel has been going on for an ungodly amount of time because it's a duel between, arguably, two meta decks. The first deck, a Snake Eyes deck, requires only 3 Snake Eyes cards to set a whole board of catastrophic damage. The opposing deck, a Prank Kids deck, is the same way. You only need a certain few monsters and a spell card to activate an entire board of Meow Meow Mews, Barking Boos, Rocket Roosters, and other cards that make me question why I bother playing this fucking game. The way these two decks are comprised makes their combinations long and powerful. They can seldom be countered unless you have a graveyard effect negation card, or they're given a historically atrocious first hand, and even then they can bounce back fairly easily if they have any backups, which they definitely do. That's what makes these decks part of a new meta in Master Duels. They have no manageable counters, while also being ridiculously easy to summon almost every monster you need. They're not the only decks that are like this. I have a Gravekeeper's deck that is very similar, but that deck is refined to be an intermediate deck made for countering meta decks. But even that doesn't work against these titans half the time. Now you, the audience, are probably wondering why I'm talking to you about Yu-Gi-Oh! Of all things. Didn't you used to be a Persona YouTuber, you may be asking? We don't talk about it. Meta is the keyword I wanted to focus on, not because I'm mad I keep losing to a bunch of little kids and wow wow wubsy, but because meta is such a commonly used word in every online multiplayer game, and knowing what it means and how it works is quite important if you find yourself wanting to play a multiplayer game soon. Newsflash, you shouldn't. The word meta has a few different language origins, but the one that we generally derive the word and its meaning from is Latin, where meta is considered to be a reflection according to Merriam-Webster. What this means generally is that meta refers to a self-reflection. For example, meta critiquing is the art of criticizing the way people critique things, i.e., the YouTube comment section. Meta, as it pertains to video games, is very similar. A meta in a video game is essentially a reflection of the players. It's an in-game product that beats all other in-game products, thus being the most used. Most people in gaming communities simply use meta as a way of pointing out something overly used by most players because it's really fucking good. Let's go back to that Yu-Gi-Oh deck. Do you see that card right there? That's a Snake Eyes monster. What does it do? Everything. Snake Eyes decks in Master Duels are the latest and greatest meta. If you go into a ranked lobby, especially past midnight, you'll see these decks in almost every match you play. I would know. I've been unlucky enough to experience them myself. Another fairly meta deck right now? Labyrinth decks. God, I hate Labyrinth decks. If you don't know Yu-Gi-Oh! That well, because you're not a nerd, almost every other game has some kind of meta. Rainbow Six Siege has its new ACOG meta after dismantling its 1.5 times scope meta, which came after its previous ACOG meta. Call of Duty has a new gun meta every 12 minutes, Mortal Kombat always has character metas, etc, etc. Metas can be traced back to NES games in the 1980s, which sounds like a reach, but bear with me. Single-player games have always had the most optimal strategies that can be used to beat them. We call these strategies guides. Now, if our definition of meta is to be believed, that would mean that it would only be slightly reaching to claim that single-player guides, often promoted by their respective communities, are the meta for their games. They're the most optimal way to play the game, and the majority of players have, at one point, played and beat the game this way. Other guides exist. I bet millions of guides are produced for video games, especially popular ones, but there's always that one guide that everyone knows about. Even certain parts of guides can be considered meta since they're used in multiple guides. My example being the Abstract Daddy guide in Silent Hill 2. The Abstract Daddy is an interesting boss battle towards the end of Silent Hill 2 and can be a speedrunner's worst nightmare. But if they obtain Pyramid Head's great knife, they can spam lock the daddy. We're cutting that out, right guys? Right? They can spam lock the boss until it dies, which will happen very quickly. To my understanding, the chainsaw can also have this effect, but I can't guarantee that. My point... Wait, what was my point? My point is that the strategy I just gave you is in almost every single popular Silent Hill 2 playthrough guide. Meta. Any tried and true strategy in a video game is, for all intents and purposes, meta. but the popularity of the word stems from something that both rots your brain and gives you heart problems: online multiplayers. The worst thing you can do to yourself in 2024 is play an online multiplayer game. But if you do, metas also exist in these environments, and even better, they get more complicated. In June of 2021, almost 3 years ago, that's a hard pill to swallow, I made a video titled Exploits in Video Games. It did pretty well, garnering just under 3,000 views, and its purpose was to express the nature of players using exploits to win multiplayer games, including overpowered weapons, operators with ridiculous combinations that made them borderline unstoppable, and secondary equipment that can blow up an entire team of players with a single grenade. Black Ops 3. I mentioned that video because online multiplayers are where metas and exploits tend to mesh together into an amalgamation of disappointing matches and OTKs. The best way to look at metas and exploits, since they're not always the same, is like this. All exploits are meta, but not all metas are exploits. Here's an example. Deimos is the newest operator in Rainbow Six Siege alongside the newest season, Operation Deadly Omen. A hell of a name. Just like every other new operator before him, Deimos is the latest and greatest meta in the game, and for a good reason. He can actively track an enemy with his Deathmark tracker, a flying probe that live pings a defender for him, and just in case that wasn't meta enough for you, the indie company Ubisoft decided to give him a revolver that does 78 damage and has no recoil. Seems reasonable, right? Now you, the audience, may be wondering how on earth Deimos is not a completely exploitative operator that needs to be nerfed as soon as humanly possible. Well, as is everything else in this pathetic life, it's more complicated than you think. Deimos and Siege are great examples of soft metas and hard metas. I know, that sounds like a poorly worded innuendo, but peep game and lock in, I'm gonna hit you with some knowledge. Deimos is a soft meta. He's an operator with a really good ability and weapons. But let's not pretend he doesn't have any flaws. His ability also actively live pings his own location to the defender being tracked by him, making him significantly worse at tracking than someone like Jackal and turning the situation into an occasionally funny looking 1v1. And his revolver, the revolver that does 78 damage when ADS, only works when you hit your shots. And we all know the Siege community can't hit their shots. But let's take a moment and look at the bigger picture. Deimos is an attacker, and his ability is very offensively aggressive. But why? At its core, Rainbow Six Siege is a game about offense and defense, and for the longest time, the game has been primarily defender-friendly. Defenders get 45 seconds to set up the location that they get to preemptively pick before the round begins. And in a 3-minute round per game format, 45 seconds is an abundant amount of time. Defenders bear no logistical burden, as their job is to simply prevent a plant of the diffuser, and their abilities hinder the attackers at a rate so significant that ban phases have to exist for attackers to be able to ban whoever they think will be the biggest hindrance to their strategy. I'm not complaining by any means, that's just how it is. My point is that this dynamic between the inferior attackers and their superior defensive counterparts is what I like to call a hard meta. A meta that exists in the core structure of a video game. These are significantly more rare to find, but they do exist. Call of Duty is notorious for having its ARs and SMGs be the premier way to get kills in their games. Since the Modern Warfare series, at least, this has been a meta staple, and I would consider it a hard meta. Shotguns, LMGs, and sniper rifles all have some sort of flaw that makes them hard to fight fully automatic, rapid rate of fire master classes of weapons. Siege is just the most obvious example I can give that the community can understand. I bet plenty of other online multiplayers like Overwatch, League of Legends, and Yu-Gi-Oh! All have hard metas that have existed since launch and won't be going away anytime soon. But Siege is a bit unique. You see, Ubisoft, the indie company behind the vastly popular Uno game that every Xbox player owns, tries to fix the undeniably hard meta, with softer metas that only make the slightest of differences and will eventually get patched out or nerfed away due to the exploitation of these metas. Deimos is like a pawn in the bigger war that Siege is having with itself, and the reality is that a full revamp is necessary to combat the defender-friendly nature of the game. In a lot of ways, Deimos isn't even overpowered. He's probably one of the most balanced new operators we've ever seen. His abilities and flaws don't cancel each other out, but they don't turn him into a god either. I could see him being more powerful in lower ranks, but you'd have to know how to use him. And I doubt many silvers and golds do. But is he the current meta? Yeah, absolutely. You'll see Deimos in almost every ranked match up until he gets nerfed in some capacity. That's just a given. Now, this is a lot of information to just soak in, and I bet you, the audience, might be asking a couple of questions. One of which being, what happens when something is really overpowered, but not meta? And does that even exist? I know, I can read minds pretty well. Let's answer that. We've officially come full circle. This duel is still going. Take a look at the second deck being used in this duel. It's called a Prank Kids deck. Don't ask me why it's named that, it just is. This deck is really fucking overpowered. It can OTK easily and has so many possible combinations that derive from multiple cards that are fairly easy to obtain. It has multiple counters that the player can utilize to prevent you from using monster effects and spell trap cards, while also taking a ridiculous amount of time to set up a combo that then continues into your turn anyway, practically preventing you from summoning a monster for like 20 years. The only counter to a Prank Kids deck is something that actively restricts their graveyard, preventing them from taking monsters back out of their graveyard and back into their hand. The only problem? That's not the only source of monsters that a Prank Kids deck uses. They use their deck as well. As far as I know, the only counters to that are limiting how many cards they can draw or potentially restricting the cards they can draw from their deck. And even that potentially won't work because most of the time, these cards aren't being drawn per round, they're being drawn by effect. And if this deck goes first, there's no possible way you can counter it unless you have an infinite impermanence in your hand. And even then, that only restricts one monster out of the many that can be summoned in a single turn. You'd need like 5 of them to hinder this deck. Is this deck overpowered? Yes. Is it almost impossible to counter? Yes. Is it a meta deck? Surprisingly, no, it's not. Okay, that's a little bit misleading. Prank Kids used to be a very meta deck before Meow Meow Mew, a card that can initiate a chain of graveyard, banishing, and back-to-deck sequences, was promptly restricted and even banned. Why was it banned, you may be asking? And the answer is that Prank Kids is considered a one-card engine type of deck. Remember earlier when I said that these meta decks tend to take forever with their combos, Snake Eyes for example? Well, that's because meta decks tend to be comprised of engines, a group of cards that combo really well together, and a one-card engine is essentially a group of cards that only need a single effect card to get the ball rolling. Snake Eyes decks are like this, Labyrinth decks are like this, and yes, Prank Kids decks are like this as well. What makes Prank Kids unique is that it was promptly nerfed last year, and then Konami proceeded to unnerf it. So Prank Kids was meta last year, got nerfed, and now is basically the same deck it was when it was meta. So it has to be a meta deck, right? No, it's not. Some fucking how. Think you can guess the usage rate of this Prank Kids card right here? Locked in your answer? Good. It's 0.09%. This deck is virtually unknown in its overpowered nature. The only reason I know of it is because my friend Javen decided to make this deck, and it happened to be the deck that kicked all of our asses. And when we tell him his deck is meta, his counter argument, unfortunately, is completely fair. Nobody uses this deck. Earlier, we defined meta as something the community overall agrees on strategy-wise. And Prank Kids, quite obviously, is not on the community's radar. Yet. It will, and when it does, it'll probably get restricted again, and Javen will have to use a deck that isn't unbelievably overpowered. But Prank Kids is an overpowered engine that has meta potential, and at one point was meta, so I'm going to call this a post-meta, pre-meta deck, if that makes any sense. This is too much talk about meta. So, what did we learn today? Well, we learned about the origins and the popularity of the word meta, the difference between soft and hard metas, and what makes something meta and non-meta. Are you, the audience, going to retain any of this information after you click off of this video? Nope. But I'm glad I got to yap for like 20 minutes. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It's free. I promise. I make commentary videos most of the time, and the other times I don't. They're just, well, they're just kind of there. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video, whenever that comes out. Bye-bye.